Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm really excited for today's deep dive because we're going to be talking about something that you are obviously super into.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, recreational diving and how it affects coral reefs. And you sent us some really interesting stuff from chapter 14 of Outdoor Recreation.
Awesome. Can't wait to unpack that.
Yeah, me too. It looks fascinating. So get ready because we're about to go on a journey through these amazing underwater ecosystems. We'll see how fish behave, and maybe even uncover a few surprising facts.
I love surprises. Let's do it.
Okay, well, first off, I have to admit something. I always just assume diving is all about those tropical coral reefs.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we usually see in the pictures, right?
Exactly. But when I started reading the stuff you sent over,
What do you think?
I was blown away by how many different environments people actually dive in. Like, I had no idea.
Yeah, there are so many.
I know. It mentioned everything from, like, freshwater lakes to quarries that are, like, flooded. It even talked about diving in the polar regions.
Oh, yeah, the polar regions are wild. Totally different experience.
I can imagine. I mean, I never would have thought about diving in a quarry. What's that even like?
Well, picture this. You're diving into this, like, crystal clear water. Super clear, right?
Okay, I'm picturing.
And then you're surrounded by these towering rock formations. It's like a whole different world down there.
That sounds incredible. And then there's wreck diving, which has always kind of fascinated me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the idea of exploring these, like, sunken ships, you know, with all their history and mystery, it seems like it could be a good way to, like, give those coral reefs a break from all the divers.
Yeah, that's a good point. But wreck diving actually has its own, set of challenges.
Oh, really? I didn't think about that.
Yeah, like think about souvenir hunting. People taking things from the wrecks can damage them.
Makes sense.
And even the air bubbles that we release when we dive, those can speed up how fast the wreck corrodes, rusts away.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
It's a real concern. And then, of course, there's the ethical side of things. We need to be respectful of historical sites, especially war graves.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are places that deserve our reverence, not our, interference.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
For sure. But even something as simple as snorkeling, which you'd think would be pretty low impact.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, even that can cause damage if it's not done carefully.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Even just a light brush from a fin can hurt those corals. They're really fragile.
It's easy to forget how sensitive those ecosystems are.
Yeah, and then there's the whole, swimming with cetaceans thing, which is becoming super popular.
Oh, you mean like swimming with whales?
Exactly. Especially with the dwarf minke whales in Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It's a big tourist draw.
Wow, that sounds incredible.
Uh-huh.
But I can see how that kind of interaction would need to be carefully managed.
Oh, absolutely. We can't be disturbing these animals in their natural habitat. That's why there are, codes of conduct and stuff.
Oh, yeah, makes sense.
The main rule is, like, never chase them. They have to come to you.
That's so cool. I mean, imagine a whale choosing to interact with you. That's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Definitely. Okay, but getting back to the different ways we can dive, most people, when they think of diving, they just think scuba diving.
Yeah, me too.
But the reality is there are all these different styles.
Fill me in.
So you've got your recreational scuba, which is your typical leisure dives. You use compressed air. You usually dive with a buddy, and you need proper training.
Got it.
But then you've got technical diving.
Oh, that sounds intense.
It is. That's where you push the limits a bit.
How so?
Well, they use special gas mixtures, explore caves, and deep wrecks. It's a whole other level of diving.
I can see how that would appeal to the more adventurous types.
Definitely. But before we get too deep into diving styles, let's talk about the stars of the show.
You mean the coral reefs?
Exactly. I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that they're actually built by these tiny animals.
Really?
Yeah, they're called polyps. And get this, they're related to jellyfish.
Wow, no way. I always thought coral was like a plant or something.
Nope. These polyps, they basically secrete a calcium carbonate exoskeleton, like a shell. And all those shells together form the foundation of the reef.
So the reef is basically a giant collection of animal skeletons.
Pretty much. And all those nooks and crannies provide a home for a ton of marine life. It's like a bustling underwater city.
That's incredible. But if those reefs are so important for marine life, what kind of impact is all this diving having on them?
That's the million-dollar question. Dive tourism can be a good thing, it brings money to communities and stuff. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. There's got to be a downside.
There is, for sure. And that's what we're going to explore today. The not-so-pretty side of dive tourism.
I'm ready to get into it, so spill the beans.
Hmm.
What are some ways that diving can actually harm the very environment it's supposed to be like celebrating.
Oh, well, one thing that really surprised me is that even walking on the reef at low tide can cause a lot of damage.
Really? I never thought about that.
Yeah, those corals are much more fragile than they look.
I guess I always just thought about not touching coral when you're actually diving. I didn't think about the above water stuff.
Makes sense, but it's just as important. And then there are those pontoons, those diving platforms.
Yeah, I've seen those.
They're definitely better than everyone anchoring their boats all over the place.
Right.
But they still have impacts, from when they're installed, how they shade the reef, and how they attract fish, which can mess things up a bit.
Interesting. It seems like even trying to do things right can still have unintended consequences.
It can. And then, of course, there are anchors.
Oh man, those can't be good.
Definitely not. Anchors are a major threat to coral reefs. They can rip up whole colonies.
It's like imagine a bulldozer just tearing through a forest.
Exactly. And those corals grow so slowly it can take decades for them to recover.
Oof, that's rough. So those no anchor zones we see, those are super important.
They are, but enforcing them is hard.
Yeah, how do you prove someone did it on purpose, right?
It's tough. And then, on top of all that, there's the impact of the divers themselves.
Oh, right. We haven't even gotten to that part.
I know. So we've talked about walking on reefs, the platforms, the anchors. But even the most well-meaning diver can accidentally bump into corals, grab them, kick them, whatever.
I can see that happening, especially if you're not that experienced.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's the gear, fins, tanks, all that stuff can hit the coral too.
Right. Plus, just swimming around stirs up sediment, which isn't good for the coral either.
Definitely not. And the numbers back this up. One study found that on average, divers break almost 2 corals per dive.
Seriously, almost 2 per dive. That's crazy.
It is, right.
Yeah.
But most of the time, it's not intentional. Divers just aren't aware of how much of an impact they're having.
So what can we do about it? I mean, is it even possible to dive without causing damage?
That's a great question and something we'll definitely explore further in this deep dive. Stay tuned. It's funny because even just thinking about which dive site you go to can make a difference.
Yeah. Are there mostly delicate branching corals, or are those tougher, massive corals more common there? It can change how much impact you have.
I hadn't thought about that. It makes me think of this nature documentary I saw where they were talking about how wave action, like the ocean waves, how those shape coral reefs over time.
Oh, you're totally onto something there. Charles Darwin, way back in 1874.
Wow, that long ago.
I know, right? He noticed that those really strong corals, the ones that look like honeycombs,
Yeah, I've seen those.
those dominated the edges of the reef where the waves were crashing.
Oh, so the rough parts.
Yeah, exactly. While those delicate branched ones were kind of tucked away in the calmer areas.
So the tougher corals were in the tough spots.
Exactly, like survival of the fittest, but for coral.
So Darwin was already, thinking about that connection between the shape of the coral and the environment way back then.
He was a pretty observant guy, and modern research totally backs him up. Corals that are exposed to, more wave energy, they usually have stronger skeletons.
So it's almost like nature's preparing them to handle those rough conditions.
Pretty much. So maybe choosing dive sites where those tougher corals are more common.
Would that help reduce the impact?
It's definitely something to think about. And, even if a coral does get damaged, it's not always a death sentence.
Oh, really? So they can recover?
Yeah, they can actually bounce back from some pretty bad injuries.
That's good to know. So, if a piece breaks off, it can reattach and just keep growing.
Exactly. But the size of the broken piece matters. The smaller it is,
The harder it is to survive.
you got it. And some species are just naturally tougher than others. It's kind of like how a small cut on your hand heals faster than a deep gash.
Right, and even if it heals, there might be a scar. So if a coral gets hurt, even if it survives, it's probably weaker and more vulnerable to other things.
Exactly. It's like that damage opens the door to disease, just like a wound on your skin can get infected.
And in a crowded reef, that infection could spread pretty quickly.
Yeah, it can. And then you've got those coral-eating critters like the Drupella snails we were talking about earlier.
Those guys.
Right. They love a damaged coral snack.
So it's almost like divers might not be killing the coral outright, but they're making it easier for those snails to move in.
Yeah, sadly, that's true. Okay, this is getting a bit depressing.
Yeah, a little bit. We've talked a lot about the problems. Are there any solutions? Can we actually make diving more sustainable?
Oh, absolutely. And some of them are surprisingly simple.
Oh, like what?
Well, for starters, pre-dive briefings. Just taking a few minutes before everyone jumps in to talk about things like buoyancy control, avoiding contact with the reef, respecting marine life. That kind of thing can make a huge difference.
It's like a little reminder to be a good guest in the underwater world.
Yeah, exactly. And it actually works. Studies have shown that those briefings can reduce diver impact by up to 70%.
Wow, that's impressive. Okay, so it's not just about what you do underwater.
Uh-huh.
It's also about what you bring with you.
Right. So we talked about fins and tanks bumping into stuff.
Yeah,
But what about all the other gadgets divers bring? Cameras, lights, all that stuff.
good point. I mean, wouldn't all that extra gear make it harder to focus on, like, where you are in the water and make it harder to control your buoyancy?
Exactly. It can be distracting. One study found that underwater photographers were way more likely to touch the seabed.
Really?
Hmm.
I guess they're so focused on getting the shot.
Yeah. And the ones with lights, they were even worse because they were trying to look into all those dark spots where critters hide out.
It's almost like the more you focus on taking pictures, the less you're paying attention to the environment around you.
Yeah, and that can lead to more accidents. But let's not forget about the fish.
Right, they're important too. No chasing turtles or trying to ride dolphins.
Definitely not. We've got to respect those animals. And we already talked about how feeding fish can mess up their behavior.
Like those sergeant majors in Brazil who got a little too used to the free food.
Exactly. But there are other ways divers can unintentionally affect fish behavior. The research you sent mentioned this study in South Africa where potato cod, which are like these big groupers, were declining at this really popular dive site.
Oh no, I bet I know where this is going.
Well, researchers think that all the diver activity might have been stressing out the cod.
I can see that happening.
And at the same time, there is this huge increase in herbivorous fish, like the ones that eat plants.
Is that a bad sign?
It usually is. It means that the reef isn't as healthy and it's becoming dominated by algae, which is a sign of degradation.
So fewer big predator fish and more plant-eating fish? That's not a good trend.
Definitely not. And it shows how even small impacts from divers can set off this chain reaction in the ecosystem.
Like that web we were talking about earlier, everything's connected.
Exactly. Okay, so now I'm really bummed out.
Me too.
Yeah.
Is it all bad news? Are we just stuck with individual divers trying their best not to bump into stuff?
No, there are things we can do. There are actually some larger scale management strategies that can really make a difference.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So one big one is restricting how many divers are allowed in certain areas, especially sensitive ones.
That makes sense. Sort of like they do in national parks
Right.
to protect the environment.
Exactly. It's all about figuring out the carrying capacity.
And carrying capacity.
Yeah. Basically, how many divers an area can handle before the impacts become a real problem.
I see. But wouldn't that hurt dive businesses, like the local ones who rely on tourists?
It's a valid concern, and that's why it's important to find a balance. Some places have started using user fees.
User fees.
Yeah, where divers pay to access certain sites, and then that money goes back into conservation efforts.
So like a park entrance fee, but for diving.
Pretty much. And you'd be surprised, but a lot of divers are totally okay with this.
They are. I would have thought people would be against paying extra.
Well, studies have shown that divers are willing to pay more if it means diving on a healthy reef.
That's pretty cool. It shows how much people care about these ecosystems.
It does. But of course, we have to make sure those fees aren't so high that only rich people can afford to dive.
Yeah, it wouldn't be fair.
Exactly. So a lot of places offer discounts for locals or students so everyone can enjoy the reefs.
That's awesome. Okay, so we've got limiting access, user fees. What else? What other management tools are out there? You mentioned artificial reefs earlier.
Oh, yeah. Those can definitely be part of the solution.
Remind me, what are they exactly?
Well, they're basically man-made structures that we put in the water to attract marine life.
Like what kinds of structures?
Oh, all sorts. Sunken ships, concrete blocks, even sculptures.
Wow, sculptures. So you could be diving on a sunken plane or like an underwater art gallery. That's way more interesting than just a pile of rocks.
Right. And research has shown that divers actually prefer those artificial reefs with the interesting features, and they're willing to pay more to dive on them.
So it's a win-win. Divers get a cool experience, and that money can go towards conservation.
Exactly. But are they as good as the real thing? That's a bigger question that we could talk about forever.
Is a good question. Okay, so we've got limits on divers, fees, artificial reefs.
Yeah.
It's a good start. But ultimately, it comes down to the individual diver.
You got it. Diver education and responsibility are crucial. Oh, and one more thing you, as a diver, can do. It might surprise you.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
Citizen science. Remember we talked about it?
Yeah, divers collecting data for researchers, right? It sounds really interesting.
It is. It's a win-win. Divers get to be a part of real scientific research, and scientists get tons of data they wouldn't be able to collect on their own.
It's like crowdsourcing for science.
Exactly. And it gives divers this feeling of like being part of the solution instead of the problem.
I love that. So, like, what kinds of stuff can divers do as citizen scientists?
So many things. They can help map seahorse populations, track invasive species, monitor the health of coral reefs, all sorts of stuff.
Wow, so we're talking about real data that scientists can use to make decisions about how to protect these places.
Exactly.
But how do we know if the data that these, like, amateur divers are collecting is any good?
That's a good question. Luckily, a lot of organizations offer training programs to make sure citizen scientists are collecting accurate and reliable data.
Oh, so there's actual training.
Yeah, and when it's done right, the data collected by volunteers can be just as good as the data collected by professional scientists.
That's amazing. It's like this bridge between recreational diving and scientific research.
It is, and it helps divers feel more connected to the ocean and more invested in protecting it.
I love that. It's really cool to think that something as fun as diving can actually contribute to real scientific discoveries.
It really is. It's all about collaboration and connecting with the natural world.
Well said. Yeah, it is amazing to see how much divers care about protecting those underwater environments.
It really is. And you know what's even more amazing?
What's that?
All that passion actually turns into action.
Oh, yeah. Like
Yeah.
how?
Well, like we were saying, people are joining those citizen science programs. They're choosing to dive with eco-friendly operators, and they're even spreading the word about responsible diving practices.
Yeah, just talking about it can make a difference.
Exactly. Every little bit counts.
Couldn't agree more. But, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some, like, bigger threats to coral reefs.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Things that are kind of beyond what we as divers can control.
Right, like climate change, ocean acidification, pollution.
Yeah.
Those are huge problems.
Yeah, those are scary. And they're impacting reefs all over the world.
It's a global issue that needs, a global solution.
It can feel kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
I get it.
Like, what can one person really do when you're talking about these massive problems?
I know what you mean. But don't underestimate the power of collective action.
Collective action.
Yeah. Even if your individual actions seem small, they're still part of a much bigger movement. And the more people who are making those sustainable choices, the bigger the impact.
So it's not just about me doing my part, it's about getting everyone on board.
Exactly. So what can our listeners do, in their everyday lives to contribute to that movement?
Yeah, what can we do?
Well, supporting organizations that are fighting for coral reefs is a huge help.
Okay, like which ones?
There are a lot of great ones out there. The Coral Reef Alliance, the Ocean Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund. They're all doing amazing work.
Those are good ones. So donating to those groups, that can really help.
It can. They use that money for research, advocacy, conservation programs. It all makes a difference.
Okay, so supporting the organizations that are already out there doing the work, what about just like our everyday choices?
Well, reducing our carbon footprint is a big one.
Our carbon footprint.
Yeah, like driving less, choosing energy-efficient appliances, supporting renewable energy.
Okay, I can do that.
It all adds up. And then there's plastic pollution.
Ugh, yeah, that's a big one. It seems like every time I turn on the news, there's another story about plastic in the ocean.
It's a huge problem. But there are things we can do. We can use reusable bags and water bottles, say no to single-use plastics, and participate in beach cleanups.
All good ideas. Oh, and I've heard that choosing sustainable seafood can also help protect reefs. Is that true?
Totally true. Overfishing can be really bad for coral reef ecosystems. So by choosing seafood that's caught or farmed sustainably, you're helping to keep fish populations healthy, which in turn helps the reefs.
So it's all connected?
Yeah, it all comes back to being a conscious consumer and really thinking about the choices we're making, even when we're not at the ocean.
Right. It's not just about what we do while we're diving. It's about our choices on land, too.
Exactly. Okay, so back to diving itself. Any final thoughts or advice for our listeners?
Yeah, give us the takeaway.
Okay, well, I think the most important thing is to remember that when we're diving, we're visitors in this incredible underwater world.
We're just guests.
Right, so we need to treat it with respect and do everything we can to minimize our impact.
And to dive with a purpose.
Yes, to learn, to appreciate, and to protect.
Love it. So as you're planning your next diving adventure, think about those choices you're making.
Exactly. Choose eco-friendly operators, pack that reef-safe sunscreen, participate in those citizen science programs.
All great advice. It all adds up.
It really does.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
Hasn't it?
I feel like I've learned so much today. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. I hope it's inspired everyone to keep exploring and protecting our oceans.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this amazing journey. Remember, the future of those coral reefs is in our hands. So let's make sure we're taking care of them. Happy diving, everyone!